Council President, I am ready
Okay,
to
great.
begin now. Yeah. All right. So beginning with the roll call. Council Member Bush.
Here.
Council Member, and I hope I'm pronouncing your last name correctly, Mona. Elshox.
Yeah, here. Thank you. That's correct.
Great. Council Member McGreevy.
Here.
Council Member, Council President Muderich.
Present.
Council Member, and I hope, Michelle, I'm getting yours right as well. Pananopoulos.
Here.
Council Member Rickards.
Here.
Council Vice President Weisberg.
Here.
And Mayor Deutsch.
Mayor Deutsch is attempting to join. She'll be with us momentarily. Okay. I would just like to use my comment opportunity during this meeting to welcome Samantha Bryant as our new Borough Manager. It is the dawn of a new day. The Borough Manager runs the daily operations of the borough, and Samantha's personality and her style of leadership and management and her own priorities to some extent will shape the future of this borough. And I know I speak on behalf of all of council. We are very proud to have reached this moment. It has been, probably 8 or 9 months that we have been working on new leadership in the professional staff, and we are very excited for what that has to bring. I also want to reinforce that I have been driving our agenda to a grinding halt over the past few months to recognize the lack of professional staff in the office. And although Samantha will have a brief grace period to figure out where the pens and pencils are in the supply closet, we will be turning the dial back on and expect our committees and the borough business to get back to our normal hectic pace of lots and lots of community involvement and questions and meetings and nice to haves to make this a beautiful place to live. So congratulations and welcome, Samantha.
Yeah, thank you so much for the warm wishes. I'm really glad to be here and really excited to be part of, what Borough Council and the residents are trying to do in Narberth.
And with that, I will hand off to Mayor Deutsch if she has any comments.
Thanks, Aaron. I too, sorry for my delay. I was having a little trouble logging on. But I too would like to welcome Samantha. We're very excited for a fresh beginning and new and exciting things to happen in the borough. And we are very confident that you will be able to lead us into this future. So welcome aboard. Secondly, the emergency declaration in Narberth has been officially lifted. The basketball courts are now open. So we are starting to get back to a post-COVID, well, not totally post-COVID, but a post-emergency declaration world. And so the parks can be used as they were pre-COVID. So that is exciting news. My annual reminder as spring has approached and the rains have come, there's been a lot of overgrowth of people's shrubs and trees over the sidewalks and over signs. Just your annual reminder to please cut back the overgrowth so that our sidewalks are passable and that signs are visible to motorists and pedestrians for everybody's safety, trying to keep everyone safe. Lastly, I received a really interesting, speaking of post-COVID, I received a very interesting email from our Fred Bush, Councilman Fred Bush, who is rather proficient at statistics and analyzing data. And I just want to take a moment and read this brief email because I found it very interesting. Here it goes. Out of the 62 municipalities in Montgomery County, Narberth has the absolute lowest rate of confirmed COVID cases over the course of the entire pandemic. We had 152 confirmed cases and 0 deaths. If Narberth has a county average level of cases and deaths, that would have been 314 confirmed cases and 7 deaths. So we had 162 fewer confirmed cases and 7 fewer deaths than one would expect if we were to look at the county averages. So I know that we've been very aggressive in dealing with the pandemic in the borough, but I think the results are very clear. I think it's very exciting, and I just want to share that information with everybody.
Thank you, Mr. Bush, for preparing it. Thank you, Ms. Deutsch, for sharing it. Subdivision and land development is the next agenda item. It is listed as no business to discuss. I know there are various plans in the works, but is that correct, Ms. Bryant? There's nothing for us to discuss or take action on this evening?
Not this evening, yes. As you mentioned, there are certainly lots of things in the works, just not at this moment here tonight for Borough Council.
I will just offer for those members of the public watching who are seeing the building erected at 114 Forest, I have gotten a lot of questions. Where are all those people going to park? And I wanted to just reinforce the fact that there will be 52 underground parking spaces in the basement of that building, and that is where those residents will park. I've heard that question a lot. Moving to 6, presentations, historic presentation or historic preservation initiative. Do I see Mr. Bressi? Yes, I do. Would you like to take the floor and tell us what the Planning Commission has been up to?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. And I'll just start by saying I had the pleasure of having coffee with Ms. Bryant yesterday, I believe. And I really appreciated her taking the time to kind of learn about the Planning Commission and our work. And I too welcome you, and I'm looking forward to your support and all the things we're trying to do to make Narberth remain the great place that it is. So anything we can do to welcome you, we would love to do that. Yes, Mr. President, we would like to provide you with an update on our progress in developing a historic district ordinance for Narberth. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that both Dave Brower and Heidi Boyes are with us tonight. They're the 2 planning commissioners who I've delegated this task to kind of carrying this forward, and they've both worked very hard on the materials that have been submitted to you. Also with us tonight is Kathleen Ablanaup from the Lower Merion Conservancy, who's been providing us with professional support, professional assistance, and particularly worked on the statement of significance. What I'd like to do is review with you the materials that we've provided and explain to you our best understanding of what the process might be going forward for council to continue considering this item. I did make a PowerPoint that has 12 slides in it. With your indulgence, I could show it. I think it might help provide a little overview, and then I'm here to answer questions. Mr. Brower and Ms. Boyes could answer questions as well. Kathleen could assist, particularly with process questions. Do you mind if I share my screen, Mr. President? Okay, I think that is a...
Yeah,
Todd, in order... Okay, great.
There, got it.
Yeah, I already scoped it out. Okay, this is mostly just to kind of help navigate what you've received. So earlier this week, I'd also like to start by saying the Planning Commission has actually not met since we last discussed this matter with council because of a quirk in the calendar. Council meets with workshop this month before we meet for our meeting. So the work we're showing you today is a work in progress. What we're hoping today is to get additional feedback from council so that the Planning Commission can make any necessary further revisions, review them at our next meeting, and then come back to council with a formal recommendation. So this is not an official Planning Commission product per se. It is simply the work of several planning commissioners who've been delegated to respond to the comments council made last month. So what we've provided you with is a statement of significance, which is a key element that explains why this is a historic district, what its historic meaning is. And this is a key element of then defining what the actual area of the district is, what buildings are in it. And this is one of the key tools that the State Historic and Museums Commissions uses to determine whether or not Narberth can apply the state historic district ordinance or legislation to this area. Following that, we have submitted to a proposed map of the historic district, taking that narrative that we've described above and mapping where that might work in the borough. We also have provided you an updated ordinance. We reviewed the ordinance with you last month and have made changes to it based on the comments, as well as also an ordinance for the actual map. So there's one ordinance for the district and one for the map. Depending on the order in which council would like to proceed, those could be combined into one ordinance. I also provided to you an informational map that classifies the buildings in Narberth by when they were built, so you can kind of see the pattern of how things evolved. I'd like to walk through these briefly, so we all can understand what we've been looking at. So the statement of significance really looks at the growth and development of Narberth from its beginnings in the early, at least the beginnings in this era, from the early 1700s to the late 1960s, which is really the period in which most of its growth occurred as first a railroad town and then a auto-oriented suburban community. And that includes residential, retail, institutional, as well as public and private open spaces. Some of the key aspects of the historic district, some of the key aspects of Narberth's significance is, again, that it charts the years from its beginning to when it matured as a suburb. It includes the early era of development, which was actually along Montgomery Avenue when it was a turnpike from Philadelphia to Lancaster. You can still see some of the smaller houses there. Our first house in the borough, Price House, is along there as well. The second phase of development was really inspired by the Pennsylvania Railroad, and so it includes the residential buildings that were built when the railroad came through. After the turn of the century, residential development and commercial development accelerated beyond the immediate environs of the train stations into neighborhoods to the north and south of that. And you'll notice that there is a shift in the kinds and size of houses that were built, depending on who wanting to attract middle-class buyers. After the 1920s, land development, housing development slowed. Probably one of the later developments before the war was Narbrook Park from about the mid-1910s into the 30s. After World War II, Narberth continued its suburban development, but began to focus on auto-oriented development, and there are a couple of characteristics you see were blocks that lack sidewalks, houses with attached garages, and fewer houses with porches. And these tend to be at the edge of the borough or the edge of the historic district. So the historic district, and Dave and Heidi and Kathleen could explain more why those post-war years are included and why it's important to consider those, but it really tracks the history of Narberth as growth as a town and then a suburban community outside of Philadelphia. It also includes the historic core historic commercial core on Haverford Avenue. And I think one of the key elements to the statement of significance that's interesting is that while the buildings pre-war have that same kind of architectural texture and detail that we tend to associate with the earlier houses, the construction along Haverford Avenue after the war tended to be more modern and plain in its architecture. But what's interesting is that even though the buildings were more plain and more modern, in scale and siting, they were very compatible with the surroundings. They did fit into the surroundings in terms of their urban form. Unlike Montgomery Avenue, which much of the development that occurred there later is not really compatible with Narberth's traditional form. So that is in a snapshot the statement of significance, the statement of why this is a coherent district, what it reflects, and why it ought to be, why it merits preservation through a historic district. The second major material we gave you was a revision of the historic district ordinance, and we focused really on responding to the comments that council made last month. So you'll notice the activities on page 9, there's a list of activities that would be, for which a certificate of appropriateness would be required. And it's really been focused on the removal of major features, which was specific guidance that council gave. Additional guidance that council gave was to reconsider the breadth of activities for which an advisory review would be required. And so the current ordinance proposes only that the addition of major features would require an advisory review. So some of the smaller, finer architectural changes, materials changes, and building elements have been eliminated from the advisory review. We also added a clarified provision by which property owners can challenge the inclusion of their property as a contributing resource to the historic district. As you recall, the historic district would have contributing resources, which are covered by the historic district ordinance, and non-contributing resources, which really are not regulated by this ordinance. There was discussion by council about ensuring that a historic district ordinance did not unnecessarily impede energy efficiency improvements. And so there's a couple of points to make about that. First of all, because we've reduced the scope of the certificate of appropriateness mostly to the removal of building features, it's far less likely that residents who want to make energy efficiency improvements or other kinds of sustainability improvements to their house would trigger the certificate of appropriateness review. They simply just wouldn't have to seek a certificate of appropriateness. Secondly, we strengthened in the organization of the ordinance the language about the HARB needing to consider the benefits of sustainability when evaluating applications as an outcome that merits weight when considering whether to issue a certificate of appropriateness. It also calls out, while the HARB can create different kinds of guidelines for homeowners, it specifically calls out developing guidelines and best practices for energy efficiency improvements. So that would help provide guidance to property owners about how to do that in a way that is consistent with other goals that the borough has. So we've taken that comment and that priority of the borough to heart. The last major component of the material we provided to you is a map of the district and a map which includes an indication of contributing and non-contributing resources. And this is really Dave and Heidi's work here. And it comes in 3 parts. It's not really possible to get this all on one slide and to make it reasonably legible. So you can see this is the northeast part of the borough along Montgomery Avenue, where you'll see that the boundary of the district pretty much does not include the buildings along Montgomery Avenue, except for a few short stretches where there are older buildings. And you'll see that there are a few cutouts where more recent buildings have been developed. And the red buildings there indicate the buildings that would be considered non-contributing, largely because they were built after the time of the period of significance, so after the mid or late 1960s. This is the bulk of the borough, north of the railroad and west of Narberth Avenue for the most part. And you'll see it covers most of the borough except for the 2 or 3 of the most recent cul-de-sac, 2 of the most recent cul-de-sac subdivisions, Hanson Court and Foxhall Lane, as well as the houses built recently where the Spanish house once stood. Those are carved out. And then there are a handful of red buildings, again, that represent later development that was later than the mid to late 1960s. This is the south side of Narberth. All of south side of Narberth would be mapped into the district because of its real coherence in terms of when it was developed, with a few buildings marked as non-contributing, again, because of the era in which they were built. So that is the material that we provided to you. This slide indicates what the process would be for finalizing this, should council choose to do that. It's important to remember that because of the way the state law is structured, that the State Historic and Museum Commission must review and approve the mapping of the district, the statement of significance, that aspect of this work before it can take effect. And they only do that 4 times a year on a quarterly basis. And the next time that they will do that is in September, for which the deadline of submitting our materials, which is our approved ordinance, our map, our list of contributing and non-contributing resources, our statement of significance, that all must be completed by August 6th to get that to the State Historic and Museum Commission. If we do not make that deadline, then we're pushed back 3 months, August, September, to a November deadline for a December consideration. So what we're hoping for tonight is to receive additional feedback from Borough Council. The Planning Commission would put this on its agenda next week for making further revisions based on what feedback we received from Council today, and a recommendation from the Commission to the Council for creating a historic district. At your next meeting this June would be the first opportunity you would have to consider this, to formally advertise it as an ordinance. The way the ordinance is written now is it requires the Planning Commission to hold a public meeting about the boundaries and which properties are contributing and non-contributing. So we could do that concurrently with our July meeting. And then Council has a business meeting in July, which would be the last business meeting before the August 6th deadline. So that would be the most aggressive schedule. If Council felt this needed more time, then of course we would aim to have this complete by the end of October, for submission the beginning of November and consideration by PHMC in December. So I believe that's it. I'm going to turn my screen off, and thank you for sitting through that. And I, Dave, Heidi, and Kathleen would be happy to entertain discussion and questions.
All right. First, Todd, I'd like to thank you and the Planning Commission for accomplishing a pretty substantial work product and doing it on a pretty short timeline, and threading a very careful needle. You took a lot of feedback from our last meeting and very quickly turned it around, and I think we're all very appreciative of that. Council members, anybody have any questions, thoughts, comments? Mr. Bush.
So first of all, I'd like to acknowledge the work you did in taking our suggestions and incorporating them. You know, the energy efficiency, sort of the changes in what would be and what would trigger a review or an advisory opinion. I'm a lot more comfortable with where these are now than where they were, a month ago. However, I note the change in the date at which this, the historic period. Originally we were talking about World War II being the cutoff. That's I was just looking at the comprehensive plan. It talks a lot about our, Narberth's construction into the 30s. That it views that as a cutoff point when sort of most of Narberth was built out. I looked at the information that we had on when houses were built in Narberth, and it looks like they really start to drop off 1940. There are a lot fewer builds than in the 30s, the 20s, the teens. And I was reading, the statement, I forget the name of it. Let me find it. The district narrative. And it was talking about the 1940s as a time of transition and, a time when things sort of changed, construction techniques changed in the borough. So it seems like to me that's a natural break point. And I'd like to hear more about why you've made this change to go up to 1969. I can't tell if it's 65 or 69. There were two different numbers in the text.
Yeah. Mr. Councilmember Bush and Mr. President, would it be possible if we could surface a range of questions before we dug into any particular question? Would that be acceptable to you?
Not a problem.
Okay.
Yep.
Because we could
You've
talk
got
about
that one noted
forever. So I'd like to make sure we surface all questions. But thank you.
Okay.
Councilmember.
All right. Well, let's go around the group and we'll accumulate some questions.
I have a question if no one else does.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Mona.
So another huge thank you to you, Todd, and the Planning Commission, because I know this is a ton of work and you guys have really done your best to become experts in this area. And I really appreciate all of that work that you all are doing. My question, I've been reflecting a lot on what Michelle's points last time about too many things, you know, in that section 6D 1 through 12, needing certificates of appropriateness. And I think I've come around more to agreeing with some of her points. And I'm wondering, when you said that, so I'm just trying to clarify, when you said that the advisory review is covering fewer items now, are all the items that are now listed under the current one in section 6D 1 through 12 certificates of appropriateness, do those all still require review from a board, or how have any of those changed? Because I could give you my reasons why I'm concerned, or I don't know if I'm just asking a clarifying question now.
Todd, is that something you can quickly answer, or is it something you'd like to hold in your queue?
I could answer it quickly, I think, but if it merits discussion, we could come back to it.
Let's do that. Go ahead.
If you were to compare this draft to the previous draft, you would see there is quite a difference between what is now proposed in 60 and what had been before. And we tried very much to take Councilmember Pananopoulos' suggestion to heart, that we really think about things that were about removals, not about additions. Removals from the fabric, not additions to the fabric. Following that advice, and I shouldn't say we, because I take responsibility for this aspect of the work, and it's, again, not been vetted by the whole commission. The advisory review is significantly changed, and it focuses more on larger additive steps and less on some of the fine-grained management of architectural details and materials that had been there before. So I think that it's focused more on things that would most likely require a building permit of some sort, and less on things like putting stucco over your wall or changing material. So I think you'll find significant changes in the advisory review, and important changes to the requirements. And again, we felt that the guidance we got from Councilmember Pananopoulos was very sensible, and tried very hard to use that as our guidepost.
So yeah, I would like to revisit it maybe a little more later, but that's just my initial.
Okay, it's on the list. Councilor.
And Aaron, just to piggyback Mona, I think you and I were pretty similar in that I really was leaning towards a much more conservative approach until Michelle really pointed out how that the bureaucracy of that and how we operationalize that, and thinking, wow, do we really have the time, effort, bandwidth, or is it really appropriateness for us to be looking at banisters, for example? And I really changed my thinking. I am really very comfortable with the revisions that you've done in on page 9 and 6D, where it really is now just when you are really radically removing, altering, or covering a significant part of the building. So mine is really more of a comment to the group, and where I was apprehensive, I am really much more comfortable with how you really radically revised that 60 section.
Are there other questions?
I had a question. Other council members? Michelle, do you have one?
Maybe just a quick follow-up to what Fred said. It's a more narrow point about it. I mean, I know that, and also just thank you again. Really, I don't want to pile on, but I know how much work this has been. This is a huge amount of work, and I know that it has involved a lot of difficult compromise and negotiation to get to this point. I really appreciate it. I would never have thought we could have done a project this large this quickly. I think it's really impressive.
All our big projects should have such short deadlines.
I agree. I'm not the queen of patience. So, where was I? Oh, so with respect to the boundaries and when the period of significance ends, I know that this has been back and forth, and this is a very difficult thing. And I heard Corey Kegaray say, from his point of view, as sort of being as part of the agency that's ultimately going to sort of, put their stamp of imprimatur on this. I think he found that there are a variety of narratives that make sense, right? So I don't feel like to me that's not it's not that important. But one thing that I noticed is that with respect to sort of the mid-century commercial buildings in the core downtown, it's not the buildings that the buildings are fine. And I contrast this with what it says in the narrative, where it talks about how, yes, in style and materials, they're more modern and modular, and that's fine. I don't care. But it says that in scale and siting, they're generally compatible with the surrounding architecture. But there are a couple of really noteworthy buildings that are, in terms of their siting, they're radically different from the rest of the downtown. I mean, they are clearly sited to accommodate large parking lots. I mean, they are very much of their mid-century time in that way. And that's the only thing that troubles me about those buildings falling within the historic district. Not so much that, I don't like mid-century buildings or something, but in terms of their siting, they're so different from the rest of our sort of historic downtown core that it's kind of like, I kind of think with respect to our comprehensive plan, like those are the properties that if there were any to be redeveloped, those are the ones we probably want to see redeveloped, so that they, we had more of your sort of classic street level, shops and windows with maybe some apartments above, that form of building. So I don't know if there's a way to keep things the way they are, but pull them out as non-contributing based on their siting, based on the fact that the buildings give so much of their site away to parking. But that's really the only thing. That's my only comment. I don't know if you've given that any consideration, but it's something to think about.
Well, that's a terrific comment, and maybe we can also hold that for a moment and give it a little more time. I think it would be better to talk about the general philosophy of the era of significance and then return to that point, if that's okay with you.
It is. Okay, let's go to Councilor McGreevy.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about the period. It's similar to Fred's point. I mean, if you were to stop at World War II, I noticed in the narrative that Kathleen did, a lot of what was significant about the contributing, houses is the front porches. And the front porches seem to drop off after World War II when we have, air conditioning that's affordable. So I'm just wondering, as part of Fred's question, it seems to me if we went back to World War II as the endpoint, then, any new construction would be required to have the front porch through the form-based code.
Should we dig into that now, Mr. President, or
Councilor Weisbord?
Yeah, and just when you do comment, Todd, and by the way, echo all of the appreciations for the work of the Planning Commission that all the council members have already made. When you do address questions, I'm wondering if you could just cover what the appeal process would be for a property owner, say that's in one of the included buildings, and say could make a good case for something that actually would be a livability improvement for the town at large. I mean, every building, while it occupies a private space, has an impact on the public space. And I think we can certainly think of buildings that are included in this historic district that, if they were replaced, might create an improvement in the public space. And I think that's something, others have pointed to in this conversation. So I'd like to know more about what the appeal process would be.
I think all council members have had a chance. Mayor Deutsch, do you have anything?
No, at this time, I'm just taking it all in. Thank you.
My question, Todd, is similar to the process with the form-based code, we knew this is complex. It's living with our community. There's going to be a desire to make changes and modifications over time. Does the modification process mirror the adoption process in terms of the need to go to the museum commission for review? Or is this something that council can, once it's sort of been established, in 12 months, 18 months from now, say, we want to make this change, we want to adjust this historic district. How does that work? What is our flexibility in that?
Okay. I'm going to ask when the time is right. Kathleen, I'm going to call on you to traffic that. I hope you have an answer. But that's a good question too. So would it be okay if we started with the era of significance, that topic? That's the biggest one. All I'd like to say about that is, as Michelle points out, is there has been enormous discussion about that, which I have mostly just followed by reading the emails about it. And I myself was a little surprised at where it turned out, but I think that I would like to ask if you can give a concise argument or proceed as to how we got to that point. I would appreciate if Dave and Heidi and Kathleen could speak to that, the reasoning behind where it actually landed. I think it'd be good to hear from you because you are the three people who really worked on this. Would either one of you like to start as to why?
Right in.
Perhaps the PC members in that group could.
Yeah, that would be best, I think. Heidi or Dave, would you like to make comments about this? Dave, you are on mute. You need to unmute yourself.
Hi, Heidi. Nice to see you.
Heidi, would you like to start?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. I think there are a couple of things that moved us to look beyond 1945 or so, which was the original date. One of them was that we looked at the numbers of structures that were built post 1945, and there was actually a consistent flow of additional building through the 60s. Yes, the majority were, I guess, in the 30s and 40s, but or 20s and 30s. But after that, there was a continuous additional construction period. And what happened is that large lots that may have had a house in the middle of them were sold and divided up. And that wasn't that much different. I mean, the original layout of Narberth as gridded streets was, accomplished through the 20s and 30s. But after that, some of the larger pieces of land that had large homes on them were, in fact, then sold and divided up. And they were over successive decades. And what happened was when these large lots were divided up, they became non-through streets. And they contribute incredibly to the way Narberth looks and feels. I mean, it didn't stop because the gridded street development stopped. It continued. And that's why these cul-de-sacs and meandering streets, I mean, Narbrook Park was actually the first one of these and sort of set a good example of how a development on a non-gridded could be done. And the other developments, I mean, what we noticed was that, do you hear me? Because my internet connection's unstable.
Yes, I hear you.
Good. So what happened was that we noticed that Country Lane was the first one that had originally been pulled out. And when we looked at Country Lane, which was in fact a large house on a big lot and was divided up, it's a lovely street. And it has these lovely homes that we think should be protected as much as any of the other homes in Narberth, just because they're more modern in their construction and maybe more pared down regarding, they don't have, the same kind of front porches or pitched roofs or, the masonry first floor, which was symbolic of the building type and style of the earlier part of the century. And then Narwin Lane was the same thing. I mean, that was then the subsequent decade, which has the split level homes. I mean, it just seems like all of these developments lend themselves to the way Narberth looks and feels. And we felt it was really inappropriate to cut it off, sort of seemed arbitrary in the 40s, that there was a significant number of homes that were developed. I think, I don't have the numbers in front of me. I don't know if you do, Dave or Kathleen, but Chloe did share this with us. There were maybe, say, 400 a year during the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and then 200 a year in the 50s and 60s. So there wasn't enough of a drop off to say those shouldn't count as significant. And I also just want to add that another point is that the purpose of all of this is to take a look at when somebody comes in and wants to dramatically change their home. It not only affects that particular house in that neighborhood, but it also affects the adjoining houses in the next door that may be a 20s, 30s, or 40s house. I mean, as the development at the end of Price above Norbrook Park really drastically changed the way the people in Country Lane feel. Any development on any cul-de-sac or street in Narberth could dramatically change the way the neighbors feel. And, it's not about front porches. It's about the continuity of the neighborhoods or the streets. That's my 2 cents.
I think for me, it was a combination of things. And I will first admit that I probably don't feel quite as strongly about this as Heidi does, but I've come around more to her way of thinking than I did originally. And for starters, I became more aware of just how arbitrary finding a date is. I started off thinking that the end of the Second World War made sense because that was such a huge dividing line in the life of the country, and that made sense. Then I realized, though, that there were a number of the brick apartment buildings, 2- and 3-story apartment buildings, that I personally felt should be protected, but they were post-war. So then I kind of drifted to 1950 as the cutoff date, thinking that would bring those into the era of significance, and that still marks the end of the war and the immediate post-war as a natural dividing line. What got me more sympathetic to the idea of extending it out to the mid or late 60s, after talking to Heidi and Dennis a number of times about it, was that I found it pretty remarkable that in our little half square mile, that when you include the houses on Country Lane and the other 50s houses and these split level and 60s houses on Norwood Lane, that you have now kind of the entire scope of suburban development in this country, from the railroad suburbs at the beginning of the 20th century all the way through to the car culture of the 60s, all encompassed within our little half square mile borough. And I thought that was pretty neat. And I thought, well, then maybe there is a rationale for including those, because while I had originally thought that the real era of significance had to do with the railroad and the suburban development that went along the railroad lines, especially, of course, the main line, that we really shouldn't necessarily restrict it to just that phenomena, but we couldn't ignore the automobile suburban phenomena that came afterwards. So that was my thinking. But as I said, I probably, if you put a gun to my head and said, can you accept, 1945 or 1950, I in truth would probably be more prone to accept that than I think Heidi might.
Aaron, May I ask
Back on this for just a sec?
Kathleen, go ahead.
Sure, thanks, Aaron. I think that Heidi and Dave articulated the justification that this group felt it needed to go up to circa 1970. Ultimately, it's a decision that the Borough Council will make, but we do know from long conversations with the State Historic Preservation Office that either one of these periods of significance would satisfy the state, which will ultimately be signing off on this. So it's really a matter of what the borough prefers. Thanks.
Okay. Was someone else trying to speak in that moment?
Sorry,
Cindy, was it you?
yeah, I just had a clarifying question and then a comment. And Heidi, I don't want to put you on the spot, but it looks like you and Dave created that map. So I suspect you may know this answer by hand. I didn't know that some of the private lanes like you're referring to, such as probably Lantwin or Shirley Circle, were once one housing property and then subdivided. Are those two examples? And that would have been post World War II?
Those were earlier. So that just shows you that that trend started earlier.
Okay, so prior to World War II.
Right.
Okay, oh, that's interesting. Which almost puts my mind at ease as we're talking about dividing land now. I think so much I panic and thinking I don't want to lose green space. I want to maintain consistency. And we're always reminded that this happened in the past. I can't imagine Narberth without Shirley Circle or Lantwin. So you put my mind at ease. Can you give an example then of an area that you're saying in the 60s or 70s that was divided and developed? I'm just trying to visualize what streets you're talking about.
Narwin. Behind, between Wynwood and Narbrook Park.
Okay.
Those split level homes, they were developed together in the 60s.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Bob.
I know we're in the middle of the planning commission members are in the middle of answering our questions from the first round. I just wanted to refine my question a little bit about appeal in light of the answer that Dave and Heidi just gave, because it helped clarify my question. The reason I'm asking about the appeal process is because I sort of wholly agree with Dave and Heidi's assessment of like kind of what's important, the good design, the good houses that we have in Narberth, whether regardless of what era they're built in, the good houses are the good houses, and and certainly there's great examples of development from different periods of time after World War II. But there are examples of properties that were developed after World War II that like basically where they just built parking lots in the front yard. Like, so I'm thinking of Essex Avenue, the 200 block of Essex Avenue, where there's some condominium buildings there that sure, the building itself might have some virtue as an example of a certain era of development, but the use of the landscape, the use of the land really diminishes the quality of life in the town. And I think perhaps Michelle was pointing to this in the in the overlay, the station overlay area, that there are certainly properties, there are buildings that in and of themselves are fine buildings and great examples of a certain kind of development that we would value, but the parking lots that occupy the space that we really want to inhabit really diminishes the quality of life. So I would just hate to see us adopt a historic preservation ordinance that sort of ends up fighting our initiatives to also improve quality of life and livability of the town. So that's why I'm asking this question about appeals, Todd. Thank you for the time.
Fred, and then we'll circle back to Todd for some follow-up.
Yeah, just to clarify a bit, when I was looking at buildings between 1940 and 65, I was primarily looking at commercial buildings because that's, we've had some development in that area. I mean, some of the developments that are going on now are commercial buildings built between 1940 and 1965. And, I think that we can discuss, whether or not we're, happy with the way the form-based code has worked, but whether those buildings were appropriate to develop, I think, they seem like good choices to me. And there are plenty of other, buildings that former gas stations, former service stations that to me, they don't really fit in with a residential neighborhood. They might be good choices. That's the kind of thing that was being built in, high numbers in that period. So that's really where I pause as I look at the commercial buildings that we would be protecting with this, and I wonder if there's a way to. I don't know. They don't feel like Narberth to me.
Well, this really speaks to the whole issue of the non-contributing buildings. And since it was my red pen who colored in the little squares on the plan, and I made some decisions about non-contributing buildings, I think I'd like to speak to that. And I am sympathetic to these comments and to Michelle's comment earlier. As it stands, when I did the plans that are in the package, I had a very small number of buildings that fell within the period of significance, but that in my logic, felt were non-contributing because the buildings had been altered so greatly that they lost their significance. And there were only two on the plans now. One is a commercial building and one is a residential building. I think there are certainly other buildings, for the most part, commercial, that fall into this category, for various reasons, not the least of which is, as Bob said, they may not contribute to the built environment that we're trying to promote with the form-based code. And I suspect there are other buildings that honestly do belong on the non-contributing list. I will say that with a caveat, and I'm very aware that, and this has happened in many places, and I think especially in Philadelphia, that when buildings reach an age of about 75, 80 years old, they go through a period of real danger of being demolished because they're no longer fashionable. They start to get old and grimy and not well kept. And there's often a great urge to get rid of them. Some of our finest Victorian buildings in Philadelphia were demolished in the 60s when the National Park was formed around Independence Hall because they weren't colonial and the high Victorian architecture had fallen out of favor. And now we look at those pictures and we say, how could we ever been so stupid to allow those to be demolished? So I agree, a 50s gas station or a split level house or a brick box from the 50s doesn't really get my juices flowing architecturally, but I also appreciate that someday we may wonder why we didn't treat them a little more seriously. But I think there are other buildings. The buildings that to me really come to the head in terms of needing to be thought through and talked about are the one-story commercial buildings along the south side of Haverford Avenue, the primary business district. Now, in terms of the period of significance, they fall within the age that they should be contributing. But except for the couple of two-story brick buildings that are on the eastern side of Haverford Avenue along the main business district, the other buildings are pretty undistinguished. I suspect they're not in very good shape in terms of their viability. And as we all know, there's some interest that entire site will be developed, or there will want to be a development on that site at some point in the future. And so the question remains to me, and I had my red pen hovering over those buildings for quite a while when I did the plans of, well, should they be contributing or not contributing? So I think there are a number of buildings, mostly commercial, but that we really probably need to give some more thought to.
Thank you, David. So Todd, back to you on this, and I think maybe, you know, there was a question about waivers and other questions. So see if you can take our conversation a little further, and then Cindy
Sure.
will loop.
I actually think the question that Councilmember Weisbord is a nice coda to this conversation. So one way, Michelle, I'm hopeful this conversation about these buildings is touching on the question you raised too. One way to handle the question is to reevaluate whether they're contributing or not. But in terms of appeals, the ultimate authority in granting a certificate of appropriateness is Borough Council. And what we're really, I think the scenario, Councilmember Weisbord, you're asking about is a demolition for the most part. You're asking, is there ever a certain situation where there's a demolition that's in the public interest, that the borough may benefit from something else in that site? Well, the HARB makes a recommendation, but the council has to make the final say. And actually, there is in the ordinance on page 10, section 7, review criteria and guidelines. The council is explicitly empowered to issue a certificate of appropriateness for a demolition if demolition of a resource is necessary to advance a significant public interest or benefit. It's just not qualified what that is. So if, for the sake of argument, council wanted to acquire a property and demolish the structure to create a park in the part of the community that needs a park, and that council determined that was a greater public benefit than the maintenance of that resource, council could vote to do that. If council felt that those buildings on the south side of Haverford Avenue that are 1 story tall really aren't the best use of that, and that the value of having those rebuilt as something else outweighs the merit of what they contribute to the historic fabric, council could vote, to issue a certificate of appropriateness for demolition. So council does have that prerogative to act in what it believes the public interest is, and ultimately then becomes a judgment of council and council's assessment of what the community's priorities are. It's not an appeals process, council member. It's a relief valve.
Okay. Cindy?
I apologize if I missed this. And Kathleen, I don't want to put you on the spot. I have not been attending the Narberth Planning Commission meetings. You're our historic preservation expert and do this in your day job as well. Can I ask your map? Were you aligned with the World War II date, or is it your opinion that we should move that timeline to the 60s?
You're not putting me on the spot, Cindy. That's what I'm here for. When I originally drew that map, and it went through the mid-40s, that reflected my general findings about the existing fabric in Narberth, which was predominantly pre-war and was very similar in terms of the pattern and the shape that it took, and the way that it eventually helped to shape the form of Narberth as we know it. And so that, to me, that was a pretty obvious end date for the period of significance. Looking up through the 1960s, I can understand and I respect where Heidi and Dave, who was more in my camp, are with it, because I think that they have completely legitimate arguments here. And I was relieved to know from Corey Kegeries at the state that, either the post 40s or the 1960s to 70s would be appropriate and would likely, get the approval of the state if our narrative was consistent and made sense and our boundaries did. But just as an historian, looking at this, I see Narberth as a railroad suburb predominantly, and I think that's really well reflected in the form of Narberth. And it, the buildings that we're talking about, the post-war buildings that we're talking about, are mainly on the periphery of the borough. There are some notable exceptions to the gridded pattern. If you're looking at Wynwood and the very large 1920s, almost estate size houses, they're still arranged in a linear fashion, but not in the way that the interior of the borough is. But with that exception, most of the fringes of the borough, or the areas that we're talking about that have these concentrations of post 45 buildings, they're concentrated on the edges of the borough, further away from the train station, further away from walkable areas, clearly more auto oriented. But having said that, I can feel comfortable with the reasoning of the 1960s, and more importantly, I think that as we were advised by the state, this is really a decision that comes down to what is it that the borough wants to protect? How does it complement or enhance or reflect your comprehensive plan? Because this is not a National Register nomination. We were told, over and over, this is very different from a National Register nomination. It really reflects the needs and the wants of the borough, and what you'd like to see for the borough going forward. Thanks.
Thank you. So what I'm hearing is, it's at our discretion, right? The other thing that I'm hearing is this does have an opportunity. I just want to point this out for council to sort of bring more land development to council's table to be the decider of whether projects move forward. And I know that in previous years, there has been a desire on council's part to depoliticize land development, to publish clear rules that say what you can and can't do. And I know that when things came to us for conditional use applications, there was discussion of how do we engineer our process so this happens less. I'm just pointing that out. I'm not taking a position on it, but I wanted to make you all aware.
Yeah, Aaron, I'll follow up on that, and I'll take a position. I feel uncomfortable with a lot of decisions being made on, without clear criteria. So if we're saying we're going to, David was saying, well, maybe I could use the red pen more and mark more of these non-conforming, non-contributing. I would prefer to have, very clear rules as to, okay, this has been renovated at this point, so it's out, but everything, rather than trying to look at it and make a judgment. So I'm uncomfortable with without clear rules for this sort of thing, and for coming to council. I mean, I expect when it comes to council, we're almost always going to go with the defaults. I mean, that would be my position going forward with this.
Bob.
Yeah, this is a question for planning commission members. I'm wondering if you thought about some kind of hybrid for determining inclusion based on both the dates that you've selected and somehow conformity with our new zoning ordinance. So there would be certain buildings that would be included because they both fit within the dates, but also also conform to the new zoning, or they might be excluded because they didn't conform to the zoning.
I think that in fact, Bob, probably the majority or a very high percentage of the buildings that are contributing on the plan are in fact in that category. I mean, as we know, most of the houses in Narberth have had some substantial changes over the years, whether it's siding or changing windows or enclosing porches. And if I took a very strict, interpretation of non-contributing, I can probably argue that all those are non-contributing. What made me not do that was because the form of those buildings have remained true to their original intent and to what we were trying to accomplish in the form-based code. And I didn't think it was going to be helpful to have 75% of the borough non-contributing, but truthfully, they in fact, look like Narberth. They look in the form that we appreciate is the streetscape that is consistent here, and what we try to replicate in the form-based code. So unfortunately, to go back to Fred's comments, as much as you'd like to quantify these things and make it into some kind of equation, there's a qualitative aspect of this that you can't dodge. I mean, the only quantitative way to do it is to have a firm date and say everything before, December 31st, 1969 is contributing, and everything after it is non-contributing. Unfortunately, it's a little messier than that. And inevitably, there will be some qualitative decisions that need to be made. Like I said, there were two cases in which I felt that the buildings have been so altered that they no longer met that criteria of the original design of the original building. And I marked them as non-contributing, but it was, like I said, a very small number.
I noticed that you marked the state store and the train station as non-contributing, and yet those were definitely built in the 60s. And yet,
actually, I thought they were in the 70s.
I don't think so. And anyway, I'm not at all interested in arguing any of those points because I think you did a great job. But I guess my question is sort of back to the question of whether or not contributing buildings could be determined both by date and by zoning. Maybe just simply, perhaps just the commercial districts, say of Hartford Avenue and Montgomery Avenue, could be determined both ways, and just do by date for the residential portions. That would satisfy me somewhat, that we would have a more objective way of determining most of the more controversial issues that could get political if council had to decide them, is exclude the commercial districts.
I'm not sure. We could ask Kathleen if that would pass muster, but I would point out, if you're thinking about those buildings on the south side of Haverford, for example, that would be a commercial building type, which is actually explicitly allowed. It's one of the options in our code, is to build a one-story commercial building on Haverford Avenue. So those buildings actually are very much one of the options envisioned in the form-based code, a one-story commercial building, as would be a three-story mixed-use building, or two-story, I guess, because it's 25 feet now. So I'm not sure that would necessarily get you what you wanted, even if that were feasible. Kathleen, do you have a sense, would that be a criteria that could be used even in because the zoning can change, right? So.
Yeah, actually, I don't think I can answer that question, but I think that I could say with a certain amount of confidence that your end date for your period of significance, or your beginning date, is really how you define your contributing and non-contributing buildings. And we were also advised by the state that integrity really doesn't play very much of a role in this, a role at all. It's not in your ordinance. It's not one of the criteria that your ordinance sets out in order for something to be included as a contributing resource. I think I support what Dave did, by considering a couple of buildings to be non-contributing because they've lost so much of their integrity that they're really not recognizable anymore as dating from the period of significance that you've outlined. But integrity as a whole is not a component of this local historic district like it would be in a National Register district. With the National Register district, you have to have integrity to convey your associations with whatever narrative significance you have. Here you don't, and that's kind of a double-edged sword. It gives the borough or these municipalities opportunities to include many more resources in the district, but it also, it kind of muddies the water, I guess, a little bit when you're trying to actually use these buildings to convey significance.
So I'd like to go back to the the principles of how we got here, and maybe that'll help steer our discussion, which, I'm watching the clock. It's important though. Two things were happening. One, we were seeing economic incentives that drove demolitions and subdivision in the borough that were not anticipated when the form-based code was passed. We were also seeing that the form-based code was limited in further modification in preventing some of those changes to our town. And we're feeling community pressure to sort of, to do something about it. We looked at what the available tools were, and the available tool under Pennsylvania law is to establish a historic district with a HARB, and that structure would allow us to have more control over whether buildings can be demolished and the reasons for which they could be demolished, and to have a relief valve, and et cetera. And what I'm hearing in this conversation is, I think primarily, kind of what date do you pick? What are the criteria for inclusion and exclusion? And a concern, which I brought up, and Fred, I'll take your sign, that you are also concerned that, every land development project could become highly politicized. But the alternative would be to do nothing. We'll have to choose some arbitrary date. We will have to, what I'm hearing from this conversation, we'll have to, if we adopt this, Borough Council will have to make decisions on certain properties. And in absence of taking on that responsibility, we would continue with the status quo. Todd, is anything I've said there, just way off?
I don't think so, no.
It's sort of, these are the tools we have, and it's not perfect, but.
Right. Right.
So, go ahead, Todd.
I was going to say, hopefully most of these processes will be rather routine, and items would reach council on a consent agenda. Really, the HARB has made the following recommendations, and the only reason council would get involved is if somebody wanted to challenge one of those recommendations, or if a council member wanted to pull it out and discuss it. But yes,
Okay.
you've painted, I think, a pretty clear picture, Mr. President.
So with that picture, and with a timeline here, I think council will, unless there's like another pressing question that someone needs answered to sort of be able, and Mona, I see you, to be able to consider this over the next 2 weeks. We would aim to consider this for advertising at our next meeting so that we can meet the September deadline for PHMC. And if we don't, it would be punted to, I guess, December. Is that right?
That's my understanding, yes.
And a concern in the community that other buildings would come down and further land development would occur without these protections in place over those additional 4 months. Go ahead, Councilor Elshax.
Thank you. So I have a different issue I want to raise, and a proposal that might also reduce the number of appeals that come to council. So coming back to why we're here, our big goal was historic preservation and, you know, deterring these opportunistic teardowns by developers. But I want to focus for a minute on another big goal that I think a lot of members of this council and planning commission and members of this community share, which is maintaining income diversity in this town. And what I started to, you know, do we want to do our best to continue to be a mixed income level town or become an exclusive neighborhood for the wealthy? And so as I was like thinking about reflecting on what Michelle was saying, you know, not all residents have the same amount of money for maintenance or upkeep of their homes. And I appreciate that, you know, the revisions that were made, like again, on page 9 and 10 in that section with certificates of approval, I appreciate that it was, you know, reduced mainly to removals, not additions. But like, I'm just thinking of examples of, you know, what if you're a non-wealthy homeowner who you inherited this home from your family, and you're, you know, people who are moving out because the housing stock is getting so high, and you're someone is getting so expensive, and you're someone whose family's lived here for generations, and you're wondering if you can still afford to live here, and you just can't, you know, like I would say keep numbers 1 through 6 on page 9, but get rid of 7 through 12, because like say you have stone columns or porch supports or something, and they're just falling apart, and you don't have the money it takes to maintain that, and you just want to remove those and go to something much more simple and less visually appealing, like wood or something like that. I think there has to be more of a balance for private property rights with historic preservation. So again, I'm coming back to, we want to prevent big teardowns of historic properties, right? But to me, I'm very uncomfortable with the idea of like the you know, 7 through 12 on page 10, like just feels more like it's becoming more like a private homeowners association where every, like, you know, to use the term Michelle was using, something like, I can't remember the fashion, I don't remember what Michelle's term was, but I think for this type of regulation, it's harder to remove these type of government regulations than it is to add them. And how many people in the meantime are going to get stuck because they don't have enough money, and all they want to do is like keep their porch going, but they just can't afford to keep it going with the stone supports or something like that. So for me, I just think it's a balance for maintaining income diversity in our town, and not making it incredibly expensive for people who live here to maintain their homes. So that's why I would propose getting rid of 7 through 12 on page 10.
Do you have anything specific to respond to that, or other members of the Planning Commission?
I would defer to members of the Planning Commission, or potentially even Kathleen, who has a lot more experience working in this arena, and what the economic, you know, hardships might be for something like this. Kathleen, could I ask you? I mean, how would you answer a question like that? I'm sure it comes up a lot in your work in other communities.
It does, and there is a means of appealing that a decision, or using an economic hardship argument before Borough Council. Historic districts, local historic districts that are regulated by local municipalities, research has shown, and this is research by economists as well as people who work in the preservation field, real estate field, that resources that are in historic districts generally maintain their value or rise in value compared to neighborhoods that are similar but not regulated. There are questions, of course, about whether creating historic districts leads to gentrification. What I hear more often is that it stabilizes property values because people feel confident that when they buy into a neighborhood, that they have some idea of what their neighbor will or will not be able to do with their property. And so it gives them, it adds to the stability of a neighborhood. And so that's one, I think that's one benefit or plus point if you're looking at maintaining diversity, maintaining your building stock as it is, that gentrification is not necessarily an outcome of this, unless you're living in a very, very wealthy community like Nantucket. That's not generally how historic districts have performed. So that's a kind of a roundabout answer to it. If you're asking me whether I think that that those kinds of changes should be allowed, I mean, that's a question for Borough Council. We know that historic districts, there are degrees of regulation with historic districts, starting with demolition and going all the way up to not being permitted to exchange your slate roof for something of asphalt. So those are all questions that we've debated for a long time. I know that Planning Commission has, residents have, and again, it comes down to how much do you want to regulate and what's your goal?
So,
Yes,
thank you. Go ahead, Todd.
I could answer that as well, Council Member. Porches are always a matter of debate in Narberth. They seem to be a flashpoint. It's been the Planning Commission's view pretty consistently that porches are incredibly important to the texture and the sociability of our town. In fact, even Councilmember McGreevy noted in talking about the statement of significance, the difference between the area when we had porches and didn't, and it's the area when we had porches which seemed to really define what Narberth's all about. So I think the Planning Commission has always been really committed to those appendages and trying to preserve them and make sure they aren't closed in or removed, because we actually think that is a critical feature of our town. The items you're referring to, particularly removing roofs, removing columns, removing railings. I mean, if you have a porch, you have to have a roof, or you have to have a column at least to hold a roof. If you have a roof, I mean, whether you replace it stone with wood, you still have to have a column. And I don't think this prevents you from not having a wooden column. It's more about removing things, not replacing them with other kinds of materials. With respect, though, to your concerns, I'm not sure this is an issue that occurs a lot with porches, and I'm not sure the difference between, maintaining a stone column and replacing it with wood. I mean, I don't know how significant that is, really, to be honest with you. I think we've tried, out of respect for not just the cost, but the burden of compliance, having to go to a meeting, having to meet certain requirements. So that's why we've tried to take out a lot of the more ordinary things like repairing masonry, replacing windows, things like that, because I think those can quickly become the kind of burden that you're talking about. But when you're talking about structural issues like porches, no matter what your income level, that's a pretty significant, if you have to, you have a porch that's not working, you have to fix it. That's a cost, that you have to deal with, no matter what your income level is. So I'm not sure that's I'm not sure that's the right thing that I would point to in terms of trying to respect people's, ability to comply. I think we've tried to do that by removing a lot of the things from both the C of A and the advisory, to just remove those burdens in general.
I think I would mention too that having a non-political, nonpartisan advisory group of interested members who are conversant in how to deal with older homes and be available to advise homeowners on how to approach these issues. I would hope would at least make the process easier for the typical, homeowner of an older house wondering what to do. I worry, and I've certainly seen over the years, that I worry about, contractors coming in and advising a homeowner. I remember when a beautiful slate roof was ripped off of a house across the street from me, and that roof didn't seem to be in such bad condition, from what I can see. But I would love, we talk about education in the ordinance, and I would love to be able to promote that and help homeowners, through what can be a very difficult and very complicated process.
I think that would be lovely if there were a lot of education. And listen, I moved to Narberth because it's a front porch community. I wanted to live in a front porch community. So I'm not debating the merits of keeping porches, like the overall structure, but so maybe a possible revision is simply in the definitions saying that removal does not include replacement with other materials. So if I can't maintain my stone, whatever, but I've got a cousin who will work with me and we can work together, and they'll do this for really cheap with me if I help them on it, and they can replace it with something else. So maybe in definitions somewhere, just saying that removal is not considered to be replacement with another type of material. I don't know.
It sounds like there is a way to maybe clarify the language, even if maybe to the architects the language is currently clear, to make it more clear possible in a lay perspective. Because I hear where you're coming from, right?
I think that's possible. Yeah, I think it's a great idea.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
So I'd like to conclude this conversation so we can move on to other items of business this evening. Council members, my goal is for there to be a document for us to consider for advertising on 6/16. So if you have other thoughts, things come to you, I'd ask that you you email Todd as the point person on the planning commission. If you could CC me so I can be aware of what may be happening. I would also ask if you could CC our new borough manager, because there's a lot of getting up to speed that she will appreciate being included in the loop. And then we have the opportunity at that meeting to review the document. Probably it's not a wordsmithing meeting, but if there are political decisions that we want to make, dates, ages, inclusion of certain paragraphs, etc., that would be the meeting for us to try to attempt that at the meeting to keep on this schedule. But ideally, we would be presented with something that we are happy with. So to that end, I'm going to ask council members whether or not, in 1965 or 1945, because there seem to be some differences of opinion, trying to give the planning commission, if there is no consensus, we'll deal with it politically in a meeting in 2 weeks. But if there is an overwhelming consensus that we want the planning commission to have a cutoff of date X, I think it would be better for us to communicate that now so that the document we're presented with is, the map and everything is proper and up to date. Does that make sense? Todd, you can stop the share now.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. You don't be sorry. Yeah, I asked you to share it. Now we're done. We're good. Bob, go ahead.
I'd like to see I'd like to see it done as they presented the proposal, but I'm hesitating about the inclusion of the commercial districts. So I feel really confident that this is the right thing for the residential areas of town. I'm a little bit nervous about the impact on the existing commercial. So I haven't made up my mind, but I'd like to, have more discussion with council members and planning commission members about that.
Okay. Anyone else?
Can we, Aaron?
Yeah.
Oh. Go ahead,
No,
Michelle.
Cindy, then Michelle.
I was just wondering, could we do a straw poll just to give, it sounds like we really are trying to determine, is it World War II, 1945, or is it up into the 60s?
That's what I'm asking.
Okay. So
I can't actually do
Aaron is
a
asking-
show of hands straw poll, but if you have an opinion, state it and I'll
just
kind of get your.
Okay.
Go ahead, Michelle.
Thanks.
Yeah, so go ahead, Cindy, state your opinion. And then I'll state-
I think for the reasons Kathleen and Rob stated, I am comfortable with moving that back to World War II, to 1945, as originally proposed.
Michelle?
Yeah, I've already said I will vote for this either way. To me, this is not a hill to die on, but based on everything I've heard, I feel like the brighter line is the one that Kathleen initially outlined, and I respect your very thoughtful comments, but I never heard you say anything other than you can live with 1965, but I didn't hear you really. And I think that I can, again, I will vote for it either way, but I feel like we create fewer ambiguities, fewer properties that maybe need to be individually evaluated for their non-contributing status if we set an earlier date that's based on sort of the train-based development paradigm that you've described. So I think that's a little bit clearer, would be my preference, but I will happily vote for either one.
Okay. Anyone else? Fred?
Yeah, so my concern is some of these commercial buildings that are between 1945 and 1969. So either boundary at 1945 or not including the commercial districts, both would satisfy me.
Okay.
And I just have to say again, like, I'm in favor. I would be really opposed to only including through 1945 because I think we're missing an opportunity to protect some of the newer developed neighborhoods that have been developed and are have great values. But I would prefer that we exclude the commercial districts. And also I agree with Michelle. I wouldn't vote against it if it were just limited to 1945. I just prefer it include more.
So hearing that and reading the faces, I'm going to ask if we could receive at the meeting on the 16th, sort of a menu, right? 4 options, right? One would be cut off at 1945 with or without the commercial district, and the other would be cut off in 1960. Is it 65 or 69? I've heard 2 years. Todd?
It's in discussion, so
Okay, so something in the 1960s with or without the commercial district. And that way, when we get to the table, we can have a discussion about sort of what's in and what's out. We can see these maps. I think it would be easier for all of us to visualize it. I really appreciate the effort that will go into creating those maps. But I think it'll let us make a discussion and give us the most opportunity to stay on this timeline and not become stuck.
And I suggest you just use 1970 as the cutoff because you've said both the mid 60s and late 60s, and it's easier just to pick a year.
1970. Let's do that. Mayor.
I just want to give my thoughts. I think going up to 1970, there's merit to it because there's whole pockets of the community that were built after World War II. and they do have, they give a real depth to the community, and I feel like cutting them out leaves opportunities for knockdowns and elimination of these parts of the borough.
Thank you. And I also, I would really hope that we have some community input on this. I know public comment is coming, but I don't see a tremendous number of people in attendance at this meeting. This is a gigantic decision that the Borough Council is going to be making to establish a historic district that encompasses the vast majority of the borough in any of these scenarios. And I think it would be helpful for all council members to get an idea of where their neighbors stand on this issue, since the point of it is to protect the neighborhood and the streets we all live on. Thank you, Planning Commission members. I appreciate it. And thank you, Ms. Abplanap. And I will see you all in 2 weeks. You're welcome to stay for the rest of the meeting, but we are going to move on to 7 information items.
Thank you
Ms.
all.
Bryant,
Thank you so much.
Thanks,
do we have
everybody.
any information items? Number 7 on the agenda? I don't think we do.
Not at this meeting, no. But I definitely expect at future council meetings you will.
Okay. 8, committee reports, infrastructure.
Sure. We met last week, and we were unable to get reports from our engineer or our traffic engineer. So a lot of the meeting was taken up by presentation from the cycling club, talking about sort of the state of cycling in Narberth, lessons learned from the pop-up bike lane. They have some requests. They asked us to look into potential contraflow bike lanes along. So these would be like a few block stretches, fairly similar on current one-way streets where they felt that people were currently biking unsafely. They were looking at the stretch of Sabine that's one way. They were looking at the portion of Haverford between the tunnel and the bank. Those were 2 of the areas they highlighted. So they're going to be, looking more into that and probably bringing that back to us later on. And they also pointed out that the mainline greenway is proceeding. So Lower Merion has been spending a lot of time working on the mainline greenway concept with some of the input from the cycling club. I think the logo for the mainline greenway was designed locally. Gene Burok designed that, and they had a request for us to do some wayfinding paint on the roads. I think they felt that Lower Merion was going to be ready to go with wayfinding later this summer, which faster than I expected. So they had a request for us to join in basically and make sure that we're ready to go when Lower Merion is. So Samantha, I don't know if you've had more time to check in with Lower Merion and.
So there's a meeting scheduled with myself and the folks at the bike group and Lower Merion Township this Friday morning, where I'll get an update on where it's at in the timeline and more specifics on what sort of signage and striping the borough would need to install as well.
We've got a couple, so they gave a presentation. We've got a couple slides that they presented for us that give us, a sense of what we'd be doing. So you can see the blue lines here are the, I believe this is phase 1 of the mainline greenway. So obviously the Narberth portions are shaded here.
The next one.
Yeah, and then this is what the markings would look like. Got the MLG logo in the green down there. They're anticipating it being painted white on the roads.
Okay.
So we have money. We have a couple possible sources to pay for this. We've got the Climate Action Plan Implementation Fund. That's a budget general fund line item. And we've also got money in the capital fund budget for bicycle and pedestrian improvements that would potentially be available for this. Right.
Okay.
So I think my understanding is, as long as council, we wouldn't need to reauthorize, we wouldn't need to authorize any more spending for this. We could just kind of, approve it and let Samantha move forward with implementing it.
Okay.
Samantha,
Would you like to do that at this meeting, or are you looking to do that at the business meeting?
Well, let me ask Samantha. Do you have what's your opinion here?
Sure. So I think we could do it as early as the business meeting. I think after I have that meeting on the 4th, I'll have a much better sense of what we need to be doing and can actually get a specific proposal on what it would cost and how we would do it. So I could do it as early as the 16th. I defer to you, Councilmember Bush, as chair of the infrastructure committee. Would you want it to come back before infrastructure again before council takes action on it, or would you be comfortable with council making a final, going ahead and moving forward as early as the 16th?
Well, I think the infrastructure committee felt that we should move ahead on this. So I think the 16th sounds fine.
All right. Well, then, I'll have the meeting with the township on the 4th, and I will get together the information that council needs to move forward with this at its meeting on the 16th.
Great. Thank you. Anything else under infrastructure?
Cindy, do you have your hand up, or are you?
I do. I have a question for you, but I'll wait till you're done your item.
Yeah, I don't think I have any other infrastructure items. So
I have a question, and if this is not the appropriate time, mute me. So Carol Murray has come to several meetings asking about the issues of folks driving down the one-way of Sabine. And, I was really thinking, again, we should be making evidence-based decisions. And I'm curious why that stretch specifically is one way. And specifically, Fred, you brought up the Narberth Cycling Club and Coalition have come to us and said, we actually have to, it's not the safest to go down Narberth, make a left at that light to really legally abide by the traffic flow. And that has been an issue there, particularly with park traffic and biking traffic increasing. So my thought was, I know back in the day, there was kind of arbitrary assignment of traffic patterning. I'm interested if infrastructure has looked for the traffic study or the report that demonstrated why that specific block should be one way. And I say this because Matt West, maybe 2 years ago, did that sign evaluation, if you remember. We have something like, it was between 500 and 600 signs, I believe. And he presented really powerful evidence that suggested, in fact, the more signs you put, the less effective they are. And he advocated for a sign diet, if I'm remembering correctly. So this is all to say, I don't think adding more signs, the evidence would suggest that that would be effective. And I do ask if infrastructure should explore, should Sabine now be bi-directional, that would then prevent the surprise of someone going against the traffic pattern, and also support biking to the park that is having more and more activity and events.
So Rob and I have had a bit of a discussion, and I think we've decided that traffic safety issues like these one-way signs should really be the province of public health and safety in the future. So I think he'll be, tackling issues like that going forward. And yeah, I'm not sure why it was originally one way. I suspect it's to avoid it being a cut through, that people don't want it to be blasting down, particularly when it was there's still kids going back and forth there. So
okay.
that's why it's the case, but I don't know. I think,
Okay, thanks, Rob. I'll transfer my question.
Offering to inform us during public comment. So.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Moving to finance and administration, Cindy.
Sure. So we finalized our priority list that I'll actually be reviewing with Ms. Bryant tomorrow. That includes grant philosophy, a strategic partnership with finance and administration and public health and safety to really develop out that new budget line under public safety and infrastructure and the built environment. Reviewing stormwater costs by potentially an impervious space tax or funding mechanism. But really, I think the conversation that we have to have this evening is one that I think I'm the most excited about, is really looking at a comprehensive plan evaluation. In May 2019, we adopted the comprehensive plan, and we are in no means suggesting that we are rewriting or editing that plan. Rather, finance and administration is suggesting that we evaluate the past and we map out the future. And how we see ourselves doing this is co-creating an evaluation tool that would assign metrics to looking at our comprehensive plan. We would ask, hopefully, the strategic planning committee of that strategic plan to evaluate, for council to evaluate. Where are we? Where have we been? And then map future planning to the comprehensive plan. I'm going to meet with Ms. Bryant tomorrow to talk about this. I would like to suggest, unless council has a different opinions, that FNA takes a first stab at a evaluation tool, a metric system. You know, we can show you all that draft, you can review it, and then we'll implement that for council members and comprehensive plan commission members. And then we use it as an opportunity to engage the public, just to do almost a state of the union of the comprehensive plan, revisiting 3 years later, what progress have we made and where the future lies. Perhaps this is something we partner with the Narberth Civic Association on. But really, on the precipice of such change, I think it's important to return to that comprehensive plan as our North Star. Any thoughts, comments, questions? Are y'all comfortable if FNA and Samantha take a first stab at an evaluation tool, we'll bring it to you all for review? Or is that something you see us doing at a full council meeting?
No, I think it's great to delegate this out to committee as a, to narrow the task down a little bit. Yeah.
Perfect. And thanks. And I very much see that the metric and the evaluation is very much a quantitative, but there has to be some sort of a context, history, qualitative aspect of that as well. And we'll develop that all for you. And then I guess just really the next important thing is please look for a doodle poll for a meet and greet. We put them off on Zoom because really we could all sit in Zoom only so much. But I would like to propose a meet and greet, not only of council, but for Ms. Bryant in the park. So council folks, please look for a doodle poll and nudging emails from me. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you. Public health and safety. And just a point of information, the CI, the actual council vote, will need to take place after agenda item 9, public comment. But if you have anything else, go ahead.
Okay. Aaron, you're referencing the repeal?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, yeah, so public health and safety met before this meeting, and Jesse Lytle joined us as chair of EAC. We would like to do some sort of press release and ribbon cutting around the EV stations so that everyone in the community is aware of the resource. So I'm happy to work with Samantha on that. So we have also asked the EAC to consider using part of their budget for the mainline greenway. So that may be the way to fund it, but we want to see if the EAC has other pressing needs. Okay, we also met with Evan Baum from the Price Crossing Homeowners Association. And he has proposed alternatives to the bollard, which is not working. And so Samantha is going to review that with the chief, and we're going to revisit that at our next meeting. It is a private road, but the agreement with the borough was to have that bollard. And so the proposed solutions do not include a bollard. So, we just have to come to some agreement. Okay, so I did speak with Fred and Samantha. We also discussed it at our meeting tonight. Which committee should take the lead? Should it be infrastructure or public health and safety with regard to the road sign review process that we all want to do? And so I would propose that public health and safety take the lead on it, because we do have the chief who is part of our committee. And that was the consensus. So Aaron, if you like that idea, then that's what we'll do. Okay.
Thumbs up from me.
Okay. We're just trying to avoid duplicating efforts. And then I would also, just to clarify, Fred, if it's okay with you and Aaron, if your committee can take the lead on the park signs.
Okay, I'll check in with Krista again. I think I told her that you would be taking it, but I'm happy to take it.
Okay.
No problem. I'll look silly, but it's okay.
Okay. Well, it just
Fred thought he was getting out of the sign business, but it's not going to happen.
Well, it's tough. A lot of these things overlap our committees, but Fred, you and I can sort it out.
Yeah, it's no problem. We can do it.
Okay. And the last, so there are many of these road sign requests that are coming to our committee. So I am going to work with Samantha to start developing the process, and we hope to have the beginnings of that at our next meeting in July. And then the last item was the update from the chief of police. We did review the training. Just as a reminder to all of us, it is part of our council's authority to assign training to the police. So it's something we can all be reviewing and be in dialogue with the chief around. So yeah, Aaron, you mentioned the repeal of the mask ordinance. I do have a motion, and I can wait. I can do that whenever you like.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments from council members on public health and safety? Okay, we'll move to item 9, public comment. Any member of the public who would like to make a comment? I'll go down the list. Mr. Winston?
No, thank you.
Ms. Scanlon, go ahead.
Good evening, council members. I have several things I'd like to discuss or bring up. And I'll just say, Mona, one, you were talking about how to keep people in town, how to keep a diverse population in town. Give seniors a tax credit. That would really help the older population stay in town. When we moved to this town, our taxes were less than $1,000 a year. And now you know what they are. I mean, how expensive they are. So that's one comment. Aaron, I'd like to address the gigantic decision, as you said, with the historic district. I'm really concerned that this is going to go through in 1 month, how people are going to find out about it. Because we know with the Sabine building meetings we had in December that there were not a lot of people who could come because people didn't know about it. It wasn't advertised to the community, especially during Zoom. How many public meetings can you have in a month to let everybody in town who's going to be affected, which is everybody in town, know about this, unless you're going to put door-to-door maps, door-to-door explanation of what's going on. Otherwise, people aren't going to know about it, and that really isn't fair to push something through that affects everybody in town. That as far as we're going with the historic district, does this change our zoning codes? Okay. And does that mean how tall is Haverford Avenue going to be?
That's a complicated question.
It is a
but it would be unchanged from what it is right now.
So I'm sorry, say it again.
It is unchanged. It would be unchanged from what it is right now.
Okay. Now, talking with the developer, is the developer on Forest Avenue going to be responsible for repairing and repaving Windsor Avenue and Forest Avenue? Have you noticed how much that road's getting torn up?
Yeah, they will be responsible for leaving it in the state that, you know, at least as good as it was when they started.
All right. And then I also wanted to ask Michelle Panopoulos, with the developer or the consultant that the newest consultant that you asked to look at 201 Sabine, have they gotten back to you with any recommendations or development plans for the building?
That we've made no further progress.
We haven't asked them
Everything's
to
been
give
on
us
hold.
development recommendations, but no, they have given us nothing.
Okay. And is there open space protections or easements that are going forward to protect the parks?
Cal Marie, can we, I've indulged a couple questions here, but I know you had some comments you wanted to make.
Okay.
About Sabine Avenue.
I do have comments on Sabine Avenue. The reason Sabine Avenue is a one-way street versus a two-way street is because the neighbors got together, signed a petition, and approached, this was before we lived here, but approached council and the manager to make it a one-way street because there was so much speeding and cut-through traffic, especially with the Merbrook buildings that was being built at that time. And another reason that it's a one-way street is because that would make the outlet of Sabine on a five-way intersection and incredibly dangerous. So that's why it's a one-way street. And as we're talking about the signage, I mean, I'm listening to you saying, oh, bike people want to have new signs and new roads. Our one-way signs have been missing. It's not that we're asking for new one-way signs. These signs have been missing, and I've been telling you all this for years. They've been missing, and all we want to do is have them replaced. And it's very frustrating that we have reasonable expectations of safety in our town and reasonable expectations that drivers have of having signage that shows which way to drive. And if there's no signs there, you can't expect drivers to know. And you say, yes, there's one-way signs at the corner of Essex Avenue, but we've talked about the crest. I've talked about the blind street, and it's a double long street. That is why I keep hammering to you. It is such a safety issue, especially with the park and with people going the wrong way. We can't get out of our driveway without the risk. I almost clipped a guy the other day. He had to go home and change his pants because I pulled out from behind my car and there was a guy driving down the wrong way down the street. So it's something that needs to be taken care of. If you think the bike lanes are a priority, okay. But our safety is a priority too. Our expectation of safety, the community's expectation of safety. So that is the question that I have. And one real quick last. During the election, the bridge was such a hot topic. Is council going to have someone advocate for our town and go to all the PennDOT meetings and be that squeaky wheel to get the bridge construction back as a top priority? Because right now, are we waiting for PennDOT to just say, yeah, you're up on the list? We need to start hammering PennDOT and say, we need this done, we need this done, we need this done, rather than just sit back and let PennDOT do their thing.
All right, thank you. I did see Ms. Bryant take some notes there. So that answers your question about the bridge. Anyone else? Ms. Grundle, nice to see you.
Hi, no, nothing from me.
Okay, I will close public comment. I will move to agenda. I'll go back to agenda item 8C1. And Mr. McGreevy, if you have a motion.
Yes, I move that Borough Council approve Ordinance 1031 to repeal the temporary face coverings ordinance.
Okay, can I get a second? And then Ms. Bryant. Bob seconded. Ms. Bryant, go ahead.
Right, yeah, my apologies to council. I realized that is actually the wrong ordinance number, just a housekeeping matter. It's actually Ordinance 1033. Because council had approved two ordinances their most recent meeting that I wasn't aware of until afterwards.
Sure. So. Mr. McGreevy, could you just restate the ordinance just so we can have a clear flow here on the recording?
Sure. I move that Borough Council approve Ordinance 1033 to repeal the temporary face coverings ordinance.
All right. And is there a second? Councilor Weisbord. Seconded. Okay. Any discussion? Okay, I'll say it. Yay.
Right.
All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? It's unanimous.
And I
Face mask
Aye.
ordinance is repealed.
Can we
What's
take
that?
the signs down, Aaron? Maybe have public works?
I think the signs would come down tomorrow morning, and and the mayor, you will sign this ordinance.
With glee. Thank you.
There we go. Done and done. Any announcements? Ms. Bryant, do you anticipate us coming back into public session following the executive session to take any actions?
I do not.
Okay, then I will take a motion to adjourn, and then we will go into executive session.
I move we adjourn.
Second on that. Mr. McGreevy had it, and all in favor? Aye. All right, good night, members of the public. And now we will go into executive session to discuss personnel matters.